everybody. Welcome to the first of our Spring 2024 series of Opening the Angus online seminars for Friends of the Angus and everybody else who's joined us here this evening. We're very delighted that you're here with us, and we're looking forward to a very wonderful and interesting evening together. So my name is Emily Burgoyne, and for those of you whom I haven't met, I am the Angus librarian at Regent's Park College in Oxford. So in a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Friends of the Angus. But before I do, I'm just going to outline a few practicalities about how the evening will run. So firstly, I want to alert you to the fact that this evening's seminar is going to be recorded. And that's with a view to it being shared with other people, other Friends of the Angus, and other people who can't attend this evening. So if you don't want your presence here to be recorded, you can either turn off your camera so that your face isn't visible in the gallery view, or you can change the name on your screen so that your identity isn't recorded. And you'll also notice that we have muted everybody, and that's to avoid any background noise interference. Please, can you stay on mute unless you're invited to speak during the question and answer session, and then you will be asked to unmute yourself. And also just to let you know that after Dr. King's talk, we'll all have a 5-minute break so you can stretch your legs and you can go and make a cup of tea, and then we will come back for the question and answer session. And that will usually run for about half an hour. Please, oh dear, please can you use the chat function to let me know if you'd like to ask a question, and can you give me a rough idea of what the question is about, and then I will invite you to unmute yourself at the appropriate moment and you can ask your question. So now a few quick words about the Friends of the Angus. We started FOTA, or the Friends of the Angus, a few years ago, and we really wanted to highlight the uniqueness and the importance of the collection, and to raise funds for important digitization and conservation work. And so far, thanks to the incredible generosity of the Friends of the Angus, we've managed to raise just under £7,000, and that is hugely appreciated. So with your help, we have managed to digitize our unique anti-slavery commonplace book. We've digitized the 17th century church records of Hexham and Hampsterley Baptist Church. We've digitized the diaries of Jane Atwater Blatch, an incredible archive giving us a glimpse into the spiritual life of an 18th and 19th century English Baptist woman. And we're also about to embark on conservation work on our chained volume of Bunyan's works from 1692, and an incredible collection of anti-slavery tracts published and sold by an English Baptist woman in the 18th and 19th century. So incredible things we've managed to do with the money raised by the Friends of the Angus. I'll put the details for making donations in the chat function, and there are also information there about joining Friends of the Angus. Of course, there's absolutely no obligation whatsoever to contribute or to donate anything. We understand completely that that's not possible for a lot of people. But it really makes a huge difference to me, to my colleagues, Julian and Rebecca, to know that we have your ongoing and continued support in trying to preserve and make available our wonderful collection for the scholars of today and the scholars of the future. So now, without further ado, I shall introduce tonight's speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Amy King. After studying at the Courtauld Institute of Art and taking a master's degree in visual, material and museum anthropology at Oxford, Dr. King worked here at the Pitt Rivers Museum. And since 2016, she has been a postgraduate researcher at the Sainsbury Research Unit for the Arts of Africa, Oceania and the Americas. And that's based at the University of East Anglia. Her doctoral research explored the photographic archive of Upoto, a Baptist Missionary Society station established in what was the Northern Congo Free State in 1890. Dr. King is now working as an editor at the Sainsbury Research Unit and as a researcher for the SEISHAT Global History Database. She has been a regular and highly valued visitor to the Angus for over a decade now, and we are absolutely delighted to welcome her this evening to give her talk, The Photographic Archive of the Upoto Mission, Congo Free State, some reflections on using visual sources to expand mission histories. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Emily. Right, I will just share my screen. Okay. Can you see my presentation? Great. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Professor Brian Stanley, I fear you may have heard a version of this talk already, so you'll be familiar with some of the things I'm about to say. But yeah, so thank you so much, Emily, for the invitation to speak in this series. It's something I've been wanting to do since completing my PhD in 2021. And it occurred to me that I first started research in the archives at the Angus Library in 2013, when I was completing my master's over the road at St Cross College, which means that I have known Emily for over a decade now, which is slightly terrifying, but wonderful as well. It also means that for a decade I have had the support of various people who have been based at the Angus Library, including Emma Walsh, and then of course Emily and Julian, and they've all helped to shape my research, to shape my ideas, my thinking around the archive, and to support me in successful research proposals. And that's not to mention the practical help in bringing me files and heavy boxes to look at. So a huge thank you to each of them. I also want to extend, I can't list everyone here, but thank you to the descendants of various missionaries who were based at Upoto, in particular Keith Kerry Smith and David Oram, but I also was in touch with the Spencers and the Suggs, who were BMS missionaries later in the 20th century. So as Emily mentioned, I will be discussing my doctoral research, which was carried out from 2016 under the supervision of Professor John Mack, who is an art historian of Central Africa, and Chris Wingfield, who is a sort of mission historian who focuses primarily on the London Missionary Society. But rather than try to present my whole thesis over the next 45 minutes, I will try to demonstrate to you how I have navigated the photographic archive of BMS Upoto, with a few sort of case studies to show how it was possible to kind of augment the written sources using photographs. So I'll start with some brief orientation in the geography and history of Upoto. I will then give an overview of the kinds of material that I chose to include in my study. And then I'll move on to some of the theoretical underpinnings of my approach and the ideas which informed my thinking about the archive. Okay, so as has been mentioned, Upoto was established in 1890 on the northernmost bend of the River Congo, close to the Belgian state post of Lissala. The BMS, as many of you will know, already had an established presence in the Congo Free State at this time. They had a series of stations that had been built along the River Congo, working eastward from the 1880s. When Europeans arrived at Upoto in the 19th century, there were two polities, or archival information suggests that there were two polities, large polities living there. So people referred to as the Bapoto, who was supposedly situated closest to the river, and the Bangombe, who were living further inland towards the more forested areas. So in missionary accounts and also other European explorer travel accounts, The Bangombe were characterized as people of the forest. They were hunters, whereas the Bapoto supposedly were canoe makers and fishers. But I think in reality, at this point, there was a lot of cultural interchange between these groups. At the time of missionary arrival at Upoto in 1890, missionaries report there was a daily market at Upoto, which drew local people from surrounding areas. And when we think about Upoto, we're not thinking in terms of a centralized kingdom like you might think of the Congo kingdom or the Kuba kingdom in other parts of Central Africa. But these were people living in large households. They were decentralized. But the households were sort of under the leadership of a central man. And in missionary archival documents, they refer to these men as chiefs. So I'm going to continue using the term chiefs for my talk. It's also important to note that missionaries were not the first Europeans to arrive in this region. Henry Morton Stanley had passed through on his expedition in 1877 and noted the presence of a large town at Upoto. And by 1890, there were Dutch traders of the new Dutch African Trade Association operating in the area. And this photograph was made by a Dutch trader of the trader Johan Langkamp, and it's kind of carefully composed to show him purchasing ivory. So in return for ivory and other raw materials, the traders exchanged textiles, glass beads, iron and copper, alcohol, guns, ammunition, hats, porcelain items, and other kind of European wares. Yeah, and this is the collection in Netherlands, this photograph album. So moving on to missionary photographers, the two primary missionary photographers who were active at Upoto during the period that we're concerned with were Reverend William Forfeit from Reading and Reverend Kenred Smith, who was from Cambridgeshire. And in terms of the photographic material that survives, at least at the Angus and elsewhere, their photographs really dominate the archive. They were both keen amateur photographers. And Smith's brother owned a photographic studio in London, and it seems that he helped Smith to develop his photographs and probably other BMS missionaries as well. Okay, so yeah, that's a photograph of Smith and his second wife, Ethel, and William and Anne-Marie Forfeit there. So what do I mean when I say the photographic archive, or rather the visual archive of Upoto? As this slide demonstrates, there was a huge range of material that I worked with. It included photographic prints, glass lantern slides, etchings, photographs reproduced in the Missionary Herald, books published by contemporary missionaries, and you can see the book Congo Land that Kenred Smith wrote. I also found ephemera and postcards on eBay, so that was a kind of, well, and sometimes photograph albums as well on eBay. So just to sort of say that there was a huge range of material. I focused on archival material in the UK and in Belgium, so I wasn't able to travel to Congo for this research. So it's not to say that there isn't archival material in Central Africa. And I was also very grateful to various, again, descendants of BMS missionaries from Upoto, who shared personal family archives and memoirs and other photographs with me. Okay, so I actually, I'm afraid I haven't captioned this image, but it is I believe it's an interior of a missionary house at the Lukulela station on River Congo, and I can double check that. But so it's worth establishing how images were being used at this point in the 19th century and how they would have been used, especially by missionaries. And I really enjoy looking at this photograph because it demonstrates how printed media came to be integrated into the domestic spaces at the heart of mission work. And so from an anthropological perspective, it shows you how important images were for creating a sense of Baptist community, the ways in which they sort of portrayed and visualized their evangelical inheritance and the wider Baptist family. And this is something, the idea of the Baptist family is something that Catherine Hall has discussed in Jamaican context. Often in these sorts of images, there are photographs or paintings of Baptist forefathers, other missionary relatives, contemporaries, and I propose that we can see here the ways in which connections were being maintained between Congo and Britain at the time. Even if you were in a remote part of the Congo, that you could visualize your connectedness to your Baptist family. And I don't have time to kind of discuss themes of domesticity and ideas of kind of civilization and kind of delve into the material culture that we can also see in this photograph. But this is something that's been touched upon by Nancy Rose Hunt, David Maxwell, Deborah Gateskill, among other academics. Okay, so what can we do with archival images? And I think this is a useful photograph because it kind of demonstrates a collection, one part of the forfeit accession at the Angus Library that I was thrilled and daunted to come across. But it's really been a treasure trove for me in kind of thinking through representation and the relationships that were documented at Upoto. And just sort of as a slight aside here, I think that in disciplines such as history and anthropology, it's only been relatively recently that the value of archival missionary sources have been recognised for what they can contribute to our understandings of the past, and particularly histories of cross-cultural encounter and colonial entanglements. I would say that they'd previously been treated with a deep suspicion by those who were not historians of missionary enterprise. So this is important because if missionary texts have been, until recently, sidelined as sources, then missionary photographs have been treated as doubly suspicious sources with which to say or do anything serious with, even by those who perhaps focus on mission histories. And we can ask why has this been the case? And I think, firstly, there are qualities specific to photographs as a medium that make them something of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, they seem to reveal everything and transport us as viewers into the historical moment. But at the same time, they can be incredibly silent about the scenes that they picture, the people who are present, the circumstances of the subjects, particularly when very little information is documented around those collections. Furthermore, there seems to have been a tendency to view missionary photography as insignificant, as having taken place at the periphery of more serious historical events, as too caught up in its own representational agendas. So the idea that missionary societies were kind of overly concerned with the creation of propaganda and maintaining a kind of visual facade for supporters at home. And I guess also on a practical level, working with photographs can be compounded by their archival settings. Sometimes photographs are uncatalogued. They can exist loose in a folder with no other surviving information. Or sometimes they've been catalogued according to sort of past criteria that's no longer relevant. or they've become attached from their original material settings, they've been removed from albums. So methodologically, this adds to their sense of being fragments, and that they are hard to pin down any historical certainties with. So the work required to integrate photographs as historical sources and populate them with historical data can be quite considerable. So the missed potential of photographs was something raised by academics like Paul Jenkins and Chris Stroud-Geary in the 1980s and the 90s in relation to histories of Christianity in Africa, and simultaneously by Elizabeth Edwards in relation to the history of anthropology. So both Jenkins and Edwards have asked independently, what does a photograph offer us as a historical source which a detailed word description of the same object could not communicate? And what kind of past is inscribed in photographs? How can their apparently trivial incidental appearance of surface be meaningful in historical terms? So out of various reflexive, post-colonial and material turns in history and anthropology, these authors set out to devise theoretical frameworks and approaches to engaging with images in order to reincorporate them into histories of cultural encounter. And I'm not going to offer an overview of all the available literature here, but I will just kind of hone in on some key points that have shaped my thinking in relation to the photographic archive of Upoto. So the first idea is that of materiality and the material properties of photographs. And this involves attending to the specific physical characteristics of the photograph as an object. We often take it for granted that a printed photograph exists, when actually the print is evidence that somebody took time to develop a negative. They chose a particular format which suited its intended purpose. For example, the glass lantern slide on the left, which I can tell you is part of the Angus collection of forfeit lantern slides. It was made for a specific purpose, and we can see that from various aspects of its kind of physicality. So the handwritten title indicates that the image was used to convey information about fishing at Upoto, and kind of demonstrate local material culture. The number 85 indicates that it belonged at one stage to quite a large set of lantern slides, and that it would have been presented within this kind of linear narrative format. And these physical characteristics tell us that the visual content was called upon to perform in particular settings. In this case, it would have been BMS lectures given to local congregations, and the slide would have been viewed in particular socially defined ways, with audience expecting certain things of the material. The second concept is that of performance, which is something written about by Elizabeth Edwards. She writes, performances, like photographs, embody meaning through signifying properties and are deliberate, conscious efforts to represent, to say something about something. So this perspective allows us to link the signs within the photograph to their historical context and the cultural stage onto which meanings were played out. So photographs are made with the understanding that their signs will be received in a particular way according to the culture and the kind of moment in history in which they were made. For example, the print on the right, I believe, is one of the photographs that was in the box with the of the forfeit accession. So the photograph This print shows a Congolese man who was affiliated with the missionary community at Upoto, and the handwritten inscription on the back says, "Industrial training of Upoto and his work." And so through analysing the setting, the clothing, the composition, in conjunction with that inscription on the back, we can kind of ascertain that there was an effort to communicate this man's identity in accordance with a particular genre of image making at this time. And this, this is something I discuss in my thesis, the idea of a particular genre that is concerned with the visible outward signs of progress of African converts, and that includes clothing and material culture. So the implication is that the dresser was made by this Congolese individual. And so we can tell that this photograph was expected to contribute to conveying a set of ideas about the work that was being done at Upoto, and would resonate with a particular audience back in Britain. The next concept that I want to mention is that of visual detective work. So again, Elizabeth Edwards has coined the term forensic looking, which refers to studying in detail the photographic surface. And such an approach moves us away from classical analyses of photography, which conceive only of the photographer and the subject, which have a tendency to impose certain power relations and sort of overstate the agency of the photographer in the making of a photograph. So by studying the visual traces of such an event, it's possible to locate sort of incidental details that were not controlled by the photographer. And this can give us clues about the sort of agencies of the individuals who are participating in photography. And it's a way of trying to sort of empirically break down visual data sort of give clues about other intentions and experiences within that historical moment in which the image was made. The next concept is that of the photography complex, which is something that James Heavier has written about. And this is a framework for thinking about the larger networks of photographic production to kind of redistribute the emphasis again away from just the photographer to the kind of larger enterprise of image making in different historical moments. So that would include the photographer, their networks, reproductive technologies through which images are transformed and circulated, and the ways in which they become socially significant. So applied to the Upoto archive, taking this broader perspective, it becomes possible to see how photographic practices at Upoto were related to sort of colonial processes and image making in the Congo, European efforts to document and define Africa, to Baptist religious agendas at home, to imperial discourses and constructions of British identity at the turn of the 20th century. Okay, and just to step back, I mean, what I think I could possibly sum a lot of that up in just a short sentence, which is to say that methodologically, it's no longer a question of what is this a photograph of, but rather what did this photograph do in the world and what does it continue to do? And the final academic idea that has informed my approach to the archive is that of reading along the archival grain, which many of you may be familiar with, devised by Anne Stoller. And she really advocates for immersing yourself in the archive, and observing how archival artifacts were used to structure and contain knowledge before kind of wading in and sort of challenging the information in the archive. We need to understand how it operated, why it operated, how information within an archive was used and by whom at different points in time. So that has guided my approach to the material at the Angus Library. Staying with kind of methodologies, this is just to show you that I used Flickr and some online software to organize the photographs that I collected. That's not to say that I am necessarily a kind of proponent of Flickr, but at the time it seemed like a good piece of software to be using when I was making kind of thousands of images over the course of 4 years. And what Flickr enabled me to do was to kind of reorganize archival images and bring images together from different archives so that I could make comparisons. I could order images into albums. I could flick between them. I could add metadata to individual images, which allowed me to then search by a name or search by a keyword that I'd tagged to an image. I thought that might be interesting just to say what I was doing with the huge number of images I collected. Okay, so I'll now turn to a photographic collection which proved really central to my research, and that is Kenred Smith's collection of images at Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. So between 1904 and 1906, Kenred Smith sent 252 images to the museum at Cambridge. So Cambridge's collection includes glass negatives, prints and lantern slides that were used as part of the university's teaching collection. And Smith corresponded with the museum's curator, first curator, who was Baron Anatole von Hugel. And the copies of the letters which von Hugel sent to Smith survive in the museum's archive. So sadly, we only have one half of the correspondence with Smith. And I would have loved to have known what Smith was writing back to him. But that said, it's still a very useful source. So at this time, the curator was trying to increase the museum's anthropological collections, and he requested that Smith make certain kinds of photographs at Upoto in line with contemporary ideas in ethnology around the perceived value of photography for documenting physical and cultural traits. So the curator von Hugel stipulated in his letters to Smith that he desired photographs which didn't portray, or betray rather, the European presence and influence in the area. He even went as far as to reject photographs that he thought weren't authentic enough, not that he had ever travelled to the Congo. And as you might imagine, this was somewhat at odds with the BMS project at the time, which at Upoto at that time, there was, great emphasis put on the supposed civilizing and advancing power of European material culture, and as a component of their evangelical work, and clothing in particular, for its ability to sort of transform Congolese behaviour and ways of life. So there was definitely a tension there between what the curator wanted and what Smith was able or willing to photograph. And as we shall see, Smith was not always successful. I should also mention at this point that both Kenred Smith and William Forfeit made donations of ethnographic objects to the museum at Cambridge. I think Smiths were not long after the photographic collection, and I think both Forsyth brothers donated material kind of from 1911 onwards. This was a fairly common thing for missionaries at the time to do. Some of the objects might have been part of handling collections that were used in their traveling lectures to local congregations. Yeah, and both men also donated objects to other museums in the UK as well. So one of the, oh sorry, let me just show you. I just quickly say that these are kind of characteristic of some of the images that Smith made. He was interested in, or rather von Hugel was interested in documenting aspects of kind of local cultural life, of the scarification patterns that you can see visible on the skin of these individuals, of dress and adornment, hairstyles, local industries. So we've got pottery work here. Yeah, adornment. I mean, the irony is, I think of the photograph of the large group with their beaded ornaments, the irony being that these were very likely white porcelain trade beads being worn that were kind of European manufacture, but clearly von Hugel was happy to accept this photograph into the collection. So what does this mean, and why does this matter in relation to the material at the Angus? So one of the most significant ways that I was able to generate new meanings and in a sense unsettle the kind of finality of the kind of textual archives was to closely study the material at Cambridge and compare it to the material at the Angus. And this was a really productive way of working because it meant that I was able to identify individual Congolese people who featured in both archival images, sometimes in completely different settings and kind of presentations. And we're talking clothing versus not wearing, or wearing kind of more traditional clothing and outfits. So importantly, at the Angus, in personal albums belonging to Forsyth and Smith, and also articles in the Missionary Herald, missionaries provided the names of individual Congolese people, or at least the names they used for them, which meant that I could kind of cross-reference those names in different sources. And yeah, it involved a lot of time studying the faces and spending a lot of time with these images, but I spent so long with them that I could recognize individuals really quite easily. And this was really key to my understanding of the relationships which existed at Upoto. The naming of individuals indicated that these weren't just snapshots of passers-by, but rather members of local communities with whom the BMS engaged on a regular basis. They had regular contact, perhaps over years. It also suggests, although we can't be sure, but it does suggest a degree of trust and kind of willing participation in this kind of collaborative effort to make photographs. And I'll just go through a few of these examples that I found quite compelling when I was looking at photographs between the different archives. So according to the caption given to this image housed in the collection at Cambridge, it portrays Congolese women carrying out a mourning ritual. They appear to be applying some charcoal, or the girl appears to be applying charcoal to the scarification patterns on the woman's back. At Cambridge, no other information exists about this image. But from looking carefully at the image, we can see that the young girl on the right who looks at the camera is wearing a kind of European style pinafore. Again, this is something that the curator was happy to look past in this image. And for me, the item of clothing suggested that this girl was affiliated with the mission. She'd been given some clothing. And so after a lot of sifting through the archives, I found that I was able to identify her in other images, this time in an album of Kenred Smith's at the Angus. So here she is posed for an image that seems to have been in the style of a mission family portrait. Anne-Marie Forfeit is at the centre. There are her so-called boys and girls employed as kind of domestic staff and helpers and translators at the mission. The children are wearing uniforms, which is kind of common at this time, and it kind of is sort of symbolic of their admittance into the mission community, and a kind of familial belonging is kind of conveyed through their kind of arrangement. And this is kind of European family portraiture at this time. So I wasn't able to identify the girl much further, but I think that her presence in both of these images is really interesting because it's suggestive of a more nuanced relationship than you would perhaps find kind of recorded in the Missionary Herald, for example, about the role of girls within the mission. It raises questions about her relationship to the women who were in mourning. Was she a family member? And our understanding of the dynamics involved in making those photographs. Clearly she was doing some mediating between these women. She was sort of participating in a somewhat staged manner, but clearly collaborating with Smith, who wanted to document this funerary ritual. So rather than seeing Kenred Smith as perhaps the primary actor, there's a sense in which she was the mediator. And again, this is just giving us a slight sort of indicator of more nuanced relationships with the missionary children who were adopted into the mission family. Okay, the next image also belongs to the set of images at Cambridge. It was intended again as a kind of ethnographic image. It depicts a central male figure surrounded by other younger people, and it was given the caption natives. And with only this information, it's really hard to say anything about why this photograph was made and how it's significant in historical terms, how it relates to work at Upoto. However, when looking through a photograph album at the Angus Library, again, Smith's personal album, I found that there were duplicates of some of these photographs and other photographs that were clearly made on the same occasion. So importantly, in Smith's album, he has annotated the photograph, and he's written the name Licala and the place Boella. So once I had the name of this man, I could then check other sources. I found that there were traces of information in Smith's memoirs, and Smith identified Licala as a local authority with whom he seems to have struck up a friendship with during his time at Upoto. He also writes that Licala had very poor eyesight and that he was effectively blind during the day. And so this perhaps explains the fact that in that first image, he's holding onto a tree stump. But the knowledge that Licala was essentially blind raises questions about the fact that he was willing to participate in photography when he wouldn't have been able to view the resulting image. And again, to me, this suggested that participating in photography was something that had come to be seen as important by Congolese political figures at Upoto, that being seen to participate and perform in photography with Europeans was in itself an act of self-presentation, of being present, of being visible to others. And there are other photographs which I argue belong to this sort of genre of local powerful families and of political figures. So The image on the left here was made by Johan Landkamp, who was the Dutch trader I mentioned at the start. This would have been a relatively early image at Upoto, possibly before 1890. And the image on the right is another one of Smith's images at Cambridge. And yeah, this is again just to say that there was this practice of photographing and documenting local leaders, but who themselves seemed to be actively involved in kind of how they were being pictured. And we could talk about the visible European material culture as well, but again, this is something that von Hugel was happy to look past. So once I knew what Licala looked like, I was able to find him again in other images, and he was pictured by William Forfeit on the left here, holding a relative's hand. And this same image was reproduced in volume 2 of George Grenfell and the Congo, in which it was used to represent anonymous Bangombe people according to a logic of ethnic types. And you'll see a kind of throwaway reference to cannibalism. And for me, it was just, again, interesting to see that if I'd only seen the image on the right, I wouldn't have known anything about Licala as an individual and the relationship that he had with Kenwood Smith, which kind of gets lost in the archive. Okay. So I'm going to move on now quickly just to talk about museum collections and the ways in which I was able to use photographic material to kind of augment and find interesting context for material collections. So I researched material, as I mentioned, at Cambridge Museum that was donated by Smith and later the Forfeit brothers, and also material at Bristol Museum donated by Smith. And these were kind of ethnographic collections, so items of material culture from around Upoto. And crucially, the images really brought the objects to life. I mean, I could mention here that I set out with this piece of research to really study collecting and missionary collecting, but once I'd been to the museums, I found that there was very little documentation of how or why missionaries collected ethnographic objects. It was really just labels with the odd name of thing, and not even sure whether the missionaries had provided the names of objects. So yeah, lack of provenance. So I had to think more creatively about what objects did with the photographs that I had, and to kind of shift my emphasis to more kind of visual representation. So yeah, what I'll say is that yeah, the photographs clearly provided a context for how objects were used and worn. That's not to say that photographs provide all the context for these objects. They don't provide everything, but they can be a first step towards unpacking how something was used and worn and by whom at Upoto. So again, the image here seems to be portraying a kind of authority figure at Upoto. The sash that he can be seen wearing in the photograph may well have been okapi skin or some kind of striped antelope skin that has this kind of color contrast of white and black, which you see a lot in the photographs at Upoto. Sadly, I didn't find any of them in museum collections, but there were other kinds of sashes. And also the sword as well, this very distinctive sword style, which both Smith and Forfeit collected, and yeah, is commonly associated with the kind of Lissala region. Yeah, and I think there's definitely more work to be done on how the objects interact. This is really a starting point for understanding those objects which have very little documentation. But I think there's real value in having these connections between dispersed material, and kind of, and perhaps eventually, I don't know, understanding the value, and some understanding the historical value of these objects, but also contemporaneously understanding what Congolese people may feel about this heritage. And something which both Smith and Forfeit collected were objects which have labels that describe these as kind of fetish objects worn by Bangombe people around Upoto. And I've used the photograph from the Africa Museum in Tervuren in Belgium to, again, kind of to find a context for how these may have been worn when there was very little information documented about these kind of power objects. And yeah, I could talk for a while about these, but yeah, just as a kind of starting point for unpacking how they were used, and the kind of problems with documentation as well, and the labels used that become very generalized. And yeah, okay. So here I'm going to move on to this idea of the photography complex, and the ways in which Smith and Forfeit's photographs circulated in other contexts, particularly in Britain. So I'm sure you're all aware of, or you may be aware of, the Missionary Herald, which was the main organ of the BMS at the time. So many of Smith and Forfeit's images were reproduced in the Missionary Herald, but also in the Juvenile Missionary Herald, which became Wonderlands, I think, from 1908, 1909. And in Wonderlands, Kenred Smith had a regular column that was called Answers from Africa. And this was essentially Smith answering letters of British children who had questions about missionary work and about Congolese ways of life. And his articles are full of photographs of his images, images that I'd come across in other archives, in the kind of ethnographic settings of Cambridge, but also images like you can see in this central one, where children are kind of posed with kind of material culture, and there seems to have been a bit of thought in kind of staging the image. But I was really fascinated to find this front cover of Wonderlands on the left, which has what looks like a kind of ethnographic image of scarification being carried out, and for that to have existed on the cover of a juvenile missionary magazine was just really fascinating to me, that kind of subject matter was being incorporated into juvenile literature, and was kind of accepted in this context, because I think the tone that Smith strikes in his reports from Upoto are, on the one hand, Congolese people are, corrupted. They're in need of the Christian mission. That they are both other, but simultaneously relatable. And he manages to tread this line between, their otherness and their potential for salvation as well. In his articles, he also he kind of writes to British children about their own place in the world in relation to other mission fields, but primarily Congo. So he has this kind of notion of the Christian family, which doesn't straightforwardly map onto British colonial possessions, but rather there's an image of a Christian empire through the lens of the BMS. But there are nuances of a kind of imperialist rhetoric as well. But he was pretty preoccupied with other places in which the BMS mission was active at this time, and he'll reference India, and children in Congo do it this way, but children in Jamaica do it that way, and that sort of thing. So again, these sort of comparisons and building a sense of children's place in the world. Okay. So yeah, again, for me, it's just fascinating to find these images in quite a different context, repurposed for an entirely different audience, and the ways in which they can be linked to new ideas about hierarchical relationships, British identity, Christian community. So again, we come back to the question of what did these photographs do as material artifacts? What did they do in the world? And importantly, what did they do in relation to British Baptists at the time? Oh yeah, just again, a wonderful example of how, on the one hand, an image is being used in the teaching collection of Cambridge University in their lantern slide collection. And on the other hand, Smith is repurposing that image, or not even necessarily Smith, but whoever was responsible at Mission House for producing Wonderlands, the children's magazine, the way in which these images can kind of go on to do quite different work, one in an academic discipline and one in a kind of children's literature. Okay, and what I will also just say here is that during my research, I definitely found evidence of photographs being passed around at missionary lectures, the lectures that Smith and Forfeit gave whilst they were on furlough, kind of travelling to local churches. So they would give lantern slide lectures. We know that. We can look at William Forfeit's lantern slide collection. But there are newspaper reports of these events at local churches, and we know that objects were passed around, and photographs were handled by the congregation. And for me, again, this is really significant for thinking of photographs as objects and the building of those connections between communities in Britain and the Congo. One short snippet from a newspaper article that was written on the 20th of January 1899. So Cameron Smith returned to Cambridgeshire. He returned to the village of Willingham, where he was from, and he presented to the congregation there. And I'll just quote from that article. Then everybody eyed and handled with interest a photograph of the African boy whom Willingham has made its special care. Willie Willingham is an intelligent-looking native whom it is hoped may yet come to see his English friends. One of his books was there. His writing tells a tale of careful tuition and wonderful aptitude. It would put many a seventh standard lad to shame. So for me, this was very interesting to see how these direct links were being created and between the congregation in Willingham and a Congolese boy at Upoto. And photography was part of the ways in which this kind of ideological connection to the Congo was being created. This speaks to the idea of sort of an imagined community, a kind of, again, this Baptist community, that the congregation at Willingham had both morally and kind of financially invested in Willie's education, because they were sponsoring his education at Upoto. Okay, I'm aware that I'm close to time. So perhaps one final pair of images that, again, I enjoyed discovering. The print on the right, part of the forfeit accession, again at the Angus Library, was reproduced in the Missionary Herald. Sorry, I haven't got the date there. But I think it also sort of almost serves as a metaphor for me about those relationships that perhaps aren't always visible in the kind of publicly kind of available literature that the BMS produced at the time, and that it's quite possible that some of these Congolese children were the ones making the photograph, but they were edited out of the image that was reproduced for the Herald. And yeah, it's a nice kind of discovery there. And just to finish, an image of Upoto Church from 2019 that I was able to source with the help of a participant in the Congo, with the view of Upoto Church in 1912. So just to summarize, I think hopefully what is evident is that the gains to be made from this kind of approach of working with photographs involve kind of quite minor granular details, but which nonetheless contribute to our understanding of how the past was experienced and how it was represented. So I haven't set out to rewrite the entire history of Upoto, but rather I found minor details which shift or nuance our understanding of what took place, and they create space for alternative meanings to exist. So I've been able to show through working with photographs that we can find traces of Congolese agency and more complicated relationships between Congolese individuals and missionaries, more complex relationships than kind of official BMS accounts might suggest. I've been able to show that Congolese people at Upoto were not passive during this period of colonialism. And in addition, that their experiences and interactions with Europeans at this time were in no way homogenous. And I will leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Well, Amy, thank you so very much for that fascinating talk. I think everybody here can agree that that was a really amazing analysis, description, exploration of the photographic archive, not only in the Angus, but also in other archives too. And I'm sure everybody would like to join me in expressing their gratitude and their appreciation of your talk.
Thanks.
Thank you so very much.